The house was supposed to be my quiet ending. After years of grinding, moving cities, and chasing stability, I finally landed in a peaceful lakeside community that looked like it had been pulled straight out of a real estate brochure. Calm water, clean streets, identical mailboxes lined up like soldiers. A place where nothing unexpected ever seemed to happen. At least, that's what I thought. The lake was the reason I bought the house. It sat just beyond my backyard, calm and glassy in the mornings, glowing orange at sunset. Even though the water technically belonged to a private landowner and not the community itself, it bordered the neighborhood so closely that it felt like an extension of every backyard facing it. The listing had called it a shared visual amenity, whatever that was supposed to mean. I didn't plan on living recklessly. I wasn't trying to stir up trouble. I just owned a small fishing boat, nothing flashy, nothing loud. A modest, well-maintained vessel that had followed me through 3 previous homes without a single complaint from anyone. For me, it wasn't a toy. It was therapy. Early mornings, quiet water, a way to unplug. That boat would become the problem. Before I even had the keys fully unpacked, I noticed the signs. The carefully worded welcome letter taped to my door. The thick packet in my mailbox with rules, bylaws, addendums, subclauses, and warnings bolded in just the right places to feel friendly, while also feeling threatening. This neighborhood was governed by an HOA that took itself very seriously. At first, none of it seemed unreasonable. Lawn height limits, trash can timing, paint color approvals, the usual stuff you expect when you move into a place like this. I skimmed through it all, signed where I was told, and figured compliance would be easy. Then I saw the line that would later feel like a challenge rather than a rule. No boats, watercraft, or marine equipment may be stored, launched, or operated on community land or adjacent water features. I paused, read it again, and again. The wording was vague. Community land, adjacent water features. Nothing specifically said I couldn't use the lake itself. Nothing mentioned privately owned water. And nothing said I couldn't store my boat on my own property. At the time, I shrugged it off. That was my first mistake. For the first few weeks, life was exactly what I hoped it would be. Quiet mornings, friendly waves from neighbors who seemed more interested in maintaining appearances than making real connections. I spent my time fixing up small things around the house, learning the rhythms of the neighborhood, and enjoying the view. The boat stayed covered in my driveway, neatly secured, clean, and unobtrusive. I hadn't even launched it yet. I was waiting for the right morning, the kind where the water is perfectly still and the world feels paused. That morning never came. One afternoon, as I was pulling into my driveway, I noticed a white envelope tucked carefully under my windshield wiper. No stamp, no address, just my name written in neat, deliberate handwriting. Inside was my first violation notice. The language was polite but cold. The kind of politeness that doesn't invite conversation, only compliance. It informed me that I was in violation of community standards by storing a boat in plain view. It cited the same rule I had read weeks earlier. It gave me 10 days to correct the issue or face escalating fines. I stood there rereading it, looking from the paper to my driveway and back again. The boat wasn't blocking anything. It wasn't leaking. It wasn't noisy. It wasn't even being used. It simply existed. That was enough. I assumed it was a misunderstanding, a rookie move by an overzealous board member, something that could be cleared up with a quick email or phone call. After all, this was my home. I paid dues. I followed the rules. Reason would prevail. I was wrong. Before I even responded, a second notice arrived, then a third, each one more formal, each one more aggressive. The fines started small, but grew quickly. The tone shifted from informative to accusatory. I was no longer a homeowner. I was a problem. And that's when I realized something important. This wasn't about the boat. This was about control. The HOA wasn't interested in compromise. They weren't interested in clarity. They were interested in enforcing authority, especially over someone new who hadn't yet learned how things worked around here. And for the first time since moving in, I felt something change. I didn't feel angry yet. I felt curious. Because if a simple, unused fishing boat could trigger this kind of response, what would happen when I actually used it? Before we go any further, let me ask you something. If you enjoy stories about HOA overreach, power plays, and homeowners who refuse to roll over, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. These stories get crazier the deeper they go, And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? City, state, or country? I read more comments than you think. Now back to the story. Instead of rushing to move the boat or argue emotionally, I did something else. I started reading. Not just the rules they highlighted, but everything they hoped no one would ever look closely at. Old meeting notes, property maps, zoning overlays, easements, water rights. The more I read, the more cracks I saw. The lake wasn't community property. It wasn't maintained by the HOA. It wasn't insured by them. It wasn't even mentioned clearly in their bylaws beyond a vague reference to adjacent water features, which raised an interesting question. If they didn't own the lake, why were they acting like they did? I decided to test the boundary. One early morning, before most of the neighborhood was awake, I removed the cover from my boat. I didn't launch it. I didn't even hook it to my truck. I simply uncovered it and left it in the driveway, exactly as before, just visible. By noon, I had another notice. This one included a photo. Someone had taken the time to document my property, my driveway, my boat, from the street. That's when curiosity turned into resolve, because now I understood the game. They weren't reacting to harm. They were reacting to defiance. And if they wanted to fight over a boat, I was about to give them something much bigger to worry about. What I didn't know yet was that the lake I had been admiring every morning, the one they pretended to control, was about to become the most expensive mistake the HOA ever made. And that decision started forming right then, standing in my driveway, holding a violation notice that would eventually cost them far more than they ever imagined. By the time Chapter 2 began, the boat itself had almost faded into the background. It was still there, still covered and compliant, still somehow offensive to the HOA's sense of order. But the real issue had shifted. The more I reread their notices, the more something felt off. The wording wasn't just vague, it was deliberately fuzzy, like it had been written to intimidate rather than clarify. The phrase that kept pulling at my attention was adjacent water features, not community lake, not association-owned water, not even shared amenity, just adjacent. That single word became the thread I started pulling. I requested copies of the governing documents directly from the HOA management company, not the summary packet they handed out to new homeowners. I wanted the originals, the attachments, the exhibits no one ever read. They complied, but not without a delay that felt intentional, as if someone hoped I would lose interest. While I waited, I started digging on my own. Property maps were public record. So were zoning overlays, land plats, and tax assessments. Late one night, scrolling through county databases that looked like they hadn't been updated since the early 2000s, I found the first real crack. The lake had a parcel number. It wasn't grouped with the neighborhood. It wasn't listed under the association. It wasn't even referenced in the same tax zone. It sat there quietly on the map, outlined in thin black lines, owned by a private entity I'd never heard of, a holding company. No signage, no website, no obvious development history, just a name and an address. That was when the story shifted from irritation to intrigue. Because if the HOA didn't own the lake, and they didn't maintain it, and they didn't insure it, then their authority over it wasn't authority at all. It was assumption, or worse, an illusion they had relied on for years, hoping no one would ever question it. I started paying closer attention to the neighborhood after that. I noticed how often board members walked the perimeter of the lake, how confidently they spoke about it at community events, how residents referred to it casually as our lake, even though none of them could say why. No one had ever challenged it. The HOA had simply acted like it belonged to them long enough that everyone accepted it as fact. The next violation notice arrived 2 days later. This one mentioned escalation, legal review, possible enforcement actions. It warned that continued non-compliance could result in liens or restrictions on property use, all because of a boat that hadn't touched water. I didn't respond. Instead, I made an appointment with the county recorder's office and pulled the lake's full ownership history. It had changed hands only twice in the last 30 years. Both transfers were quiet. No development plans, no easements granted to the community, no shared use agreements filed, nothing. Which raised an even more interesting problem for the HOA. If there was no legal right to control the lake, then their rule against boats wasn't just overreach, it was unenforceable. But I still wasn't ready to push back openly. I wanted to understand how deep their confidence ran. So I attended my first HOA meeting. I didn't speak. I didn't ask questions. I just listened. They talked about landscaping contracts, holiday decorations, parking enforcement, and then, casually, the lake. Maintenance costs were mentioned, though no invoices were shown. Liability concerns were referenced vaguely, without detail. It was all surface-level discussion, built on the assumption that no one would ever demand proof. I watched the board members closely. They weren't nervous. They weren't defensive. They were comfortable, too comfortable. That told me they either believed their own narrative, or they had never been challenged hard enough to know it was false. After the meeting, I walked home along the water's edge. The lake was calm, reflecting porch lights and moonlight like a mirror. It didn't look like community property. It didn't look like a shared amenity. It looked like opportunity. The next morning, I received an email from the HOA's legal liaison. It wasn't aggressive. It was worse. It was patronizing. It explained that the association had broad authority to regulate visual nuisances and community standards, including anything visible from common areas. It suggested that compliance would be the simplest path forward, and implied that resistance would be costly. They still didn't cite ownership. They didn't mention deeds. They didn't reference legal authority over the lake itself. They didn't have it. That was when I realized the fight wasn't about whether I could keep my boat. It was about whether I could expose a lie the entire neighborhood had been living under. I decided to push, carefully. I filed a formal request asking the HOA to provide documentation proving their authority over the lake. Not opinions, not bylaws, actual ownership or easement records. The response took longer than usual. When it came, it was thin. They sent me a copy of the same rule they had already cited. No deeds, no maps, no legal filings. Just repetition. That silence spoke louder than any argument. At the same time, something else happened. I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. It wasn't from the HOA. It wasn't from management. It was from someone connected to the holding company that owned the lake. Apparently, my public records search had triggered an internal alert. The lake wasn't as forgotten as everyone assumed. The person on the other end didn't accuse me of anything. They didn't ask what I wanted. They simply mentioned that the property had been quiet for a long time, and that interest was unusual. That word, quiet, stuck with me, because quiet properties are often waiting for something, or someone. I didn't mention the HOA, I didn't mention the boat, I just listened. When the call ended, I sat there staring out at the water, realizing that the HOA had been bluffing for years, and no one had ever called it, until now. Another violation notice arrived that afternoon. This one included a deadline, 7 days. That was when I stopped thinking defensively and started thinking strategically. If the HOA believed they controlled the lake, then owning it outright would do more than solve my problem. It would expose theirs. And suddenly, the idea that had seemed ridiculous just days earlier began to feel inevitable. What if the lake didn't just border my property? What if it became part of it? As Chapter 2 came to a close, the boat was no longer the center of the story. It was merely the spark. The real conflict was about to begin, one that would involve deeds, money, and a level of retaliation the HOA had never prepared for. By the time Chapter 3 began, the idea no longer sounded crazy. It sounded dangerous. And not in the reckless sense, but in the way certain truths feel dangerous once they're uncovered. The kind that can't be unseen. The kind that forces a choice, walk away quietly, or lean all the way in and accept the consequences. The lake sat there every morning, unchanged, calm, indifferent, completely unaware of the drama unfolding around it. Meanwhile, the HOA continued sending notices as if nothing had shifted, as if their authority was absolute and unquestioned. But it had been questioned, and they didn't know it yet. The call from the holding company replayed in my mind over and over, not what was said, but what wasn't. There had been no denial of ownership questions, no warnings, no defensive tone, just mild curiosity and a subtle confirmation that the lake was, indeed, privately owned and quietly maintained. That silence told me everything, so I did something that felt both premature and inevitable. I reached out. Not aggressively, not formally. Just a neutral inquiry through publicly listed channels, expressing interest in learning more about the property. I didn't mention the neighborhood. I didn't mention the HOA. I certainly didn't mention the boat. Within 24 hours, I received a reply. They were open to a conversation. That was the moment the story crossed a line. Up until then, this had been about resisting unfair enforcement, about defending property rights, about principle. But the second that email arrived, the dynamic changed. This wasn't just about pushing back anymore. This was about leverage. The conversation that followed was cautious on both sides. The holding company representative explained that the lake had been acquired years earlier as part of a larger land package that never materialized into development. It generated no income, required minimal upkeep, and had quietly become an asset no one paid much attention to. They didn't call it a burden, but they didn't call it a priority either. That was important. I asked neutral questions about maintenance, liability, long-term plans. They answered without hesitation. There were no restrictions tied to the neighborhood, no shared agreements, no obligations to the HOA. The lake was theirs, and it was available. They didn't say the word for sale outright at first, but they didn't avoid it either. They framed it as openness to discuss options if the right opportunity presented itself. That was as close to an invitation as I needed. Meanwhile, the pressure from the HOA intensified. Another notice arrived, then another. Each one referenced escalating penalties. Each one mentioned potential legal action without actually committing to it. The language was designed to scare, not to resolve. Still no documentation, still no proof, just authority by repetition. I began to notice changes in how neighbors looked at my property. Subtle glances, longer stares, the kind that suggested someone had been talking. The boat had become a symbol, not of non-compliance, but of disruption. And disruption made people uncomfortable. The HOA wanted that discomfort directed at me. What they didn't realize was that their pressure was accelerating something they could no longer stop. The holding company eventually suggested an in-person meeting. Neutral location, low pressure, informational. I agreed. The meeting was calm, businesslike, no drama. They laid out the facts plainly. The lake had a clean title, no encumbrances, no shared rights. The surrounding community had never formalized any claim to it. The HOA's perceived control existed only because no one had challenged it, until now. Then came the question I hadn't asked yet. What would something like this cost? The number wasn't small, but it also wasn't impossible. And that was the most unsettling part. The lake wasn't priced like a trophy asset. It wasn't treated like a strategic holding. It was valued like something forgotten, something idle, something that could quietly change hands without attracting attention. I didn't respond immediately. I went home and sat on my back porch, staring at the water like I had so many times before. Only now, it felt different. Less like scenery, more like a boundary waiting to be crossed. Owning the lake wouldn't just stop the HOA from enforcing their rule. It would expose them. Every violation, every threat, every assumption of authority would collapse the moment ownership changed. And the moment boats launched on privately owned water, their entire narrative would unravel. But ownership also came with consequences. Visibility, attention, escalation. This wasn't a quiet solution. This was a statement. I took a few days to think. During that time, the HOA made their boldest move yet. They sent a notice informing me that continued violations could result in suspension of amenity privileges. That word made me laugh. Amenity. They still hadn't proven they owned the lake, but they were threatening to take it away. That was the final confirmation I needed. They weren't acting out of legal certainty. They were acting out of fear of losing control. I returned to the holding company with a counteroffer. Not aggressive, not insulting, fair. They didn't reject it. They didn't accept it either. Instead, they asked for time. That waiting period was worse than the threats. Every day felt heavier. The HOA continued sending notices, unaware that the ground beneath them was shifting. Neighbors whispered. Board members grew more visible. Walks around the lake became more frequent. They were circling something they didn't know they were about to lose. When the response finally came, it was short. They were willing to proceed. Terms would need to be finalized, paperwork reviewed, timelines established. But the lake was, for all practical purposes, entering the process of becoming something else, something personal, something protected, something untouchable by the HOA. As Chapter 3 came to an end, the boat sat exactly where it always had, covered, still, silent. But it was no longer the problem, it was the preview. Because once ownership changed hands, the lake wouldn't just be water next door. It would be the stage for a confrontation the HOA had no rule prepared for, and they had no idea it was coming. By the time Chapter 4 began, nothing felt theoretical anymore. What had started as curiosity had hardened into process, drafts, deadlines, documents, the kind of slow, deliberate movement that doesn't look dramatic from the outside, but carries enormous weight once it's in motion. The holding company sent over preliminary paperwork, not contracts yet, but outlines, terms, conditions, environmental disclosures, liability summaries, everything that comes with a body of water that's been sitting quietly, untouched, and legally uncomplicated for years. The lake was clean. No contamination, no conservation restrictions, no hidden easements benefiting the neighborhood, nothing tying it to the HOA in any meaningful way. That absence was loud. I reviewed everything carefully, not just once, but repeatedly. This wasn't a decision that could be undone easily. Buying a lake wasn't like buying another house, or a piece of land you could resell quietly if things went wrong. This was a visible act, a declaration, and I knew exactly who would notice first. The HOA. They noticed sooner than expected. Before the purchase was finalized, before any paperwork was recorded publicly, the tone of the notices changed. They became less frequent, but more pointed, less procedural, more personal. Instead of referencing rules, they referenced community harmony and neighborhood expectations. That shift told me everything. Someone on the board had realized they were losing their grip. The lake walks became more frequent. Board members stopped pretending to be casual. They lingered. They pointed. They took photos of the shoreline, like they were trying to memorize it. They still didn't contact me directly. That was the most revealing part. If they truly believed they had authority, they would have confronted me head-on. Instead, they circled, waiting for something, anything, they could use to reassert control. At the same time, I noticed something else. The violations slowed, not stopped, slowed. The boat notices came less often. The language softened slightly. Deadlines were extended. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The HOA was recalibrating. They didn't know what I was doing, but they knew something was happening. I continued moving forward quietly. Title checks were completed. Surveys were ordered. Insurance quotes came back surprisingly reasonable. The lake wasn't considered high risk because it wasn't marketed for public use. No docks, no rentals, no access points other than natural shoreline. And that was when the implications really settled in. Owning the lake wouldn't just stop enforcement. It would reverse the dynamic entirely. Any rule they tried to apply would now be subject to my permission. Any claim they made would require proof they didn't have. The HOA would be forced into a position they had never occupied before, asking instead of telling. That kind of power shift doesn't go unnoticed. It certainly doesn't go unchallenged. The first direct sign of resistance came in the form of a letter. Not a violation notice, not an email. A letter from the HOA's attorney. The language was careful, non-accusatory, framed as a clarification request. It asked whether I intended to make changes affecting the lake, and reminded me of the association's interest in preserving community standards. They still didn't claim ownership. They couldn't, but they were fishing. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded the letter to my own attorney, along with every document I had collected so far. The response I got back was calm, but definitive. The HOA had no standing, none, no ownership, no easement, no recorded agreement, nothing. Their control existed only because no one had tested it, and testing it now would expose everything. That was when the holding company confirmed a closing timeline. 30 days. 30 days until the lake legally changed hands. That countdown changed everything. I could feel the pressure building, not just from the HOA, but from the neighborhood itself. People started asking indirect questions, casual comments, observations about the water, about the future. No one asked me directly, but they were watching. The boat remained untouched, still covered, still compliant, still a quiet reminder of what had started all of this. I didn't want to give the HOA any excuse to escalate before the paperwork was complete, but they found one anyway. 2 weeks before closing, I received a notice scheduling a compliance hearing. It was framed as an opportunity, a chance to resolve ongoing violations, a path toward alignment. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. They were trying to force confrontation before they lost leverage. I declined. Not emotionally, not defiantly. Simply stated that the matter was under review and that I would respond in writing once that review was complete. That response was enough. The hearing was postponed, indefinitely. That was the first visible crack. Behind the scenes, final documents were drafted, signatures were prepared, funds were allocated. The holding company moved efficiently, as if eager to be done with an asset that had sat dormant for too long. They didn't ask why I wanted the lake. They didn't need to. The day before closing, I walked the shoreline alone. No board members, no neighbors, just water and silence. I tried to imagine what the HOA would do when they found out, whether they would deny it, downplay it, or double down. All I knew was that nothing would be the same. The closing itself was uneventful. No fanfare, no announcement, just signatures, confirmations, and a quiet transfer of ownership that would soon ripple through the entire community. By the time Chapter 4 ended, the lake was no longer a question. It was mine, and the HOA still didn't know. By the time Chapter 5 began, the silence had weight. Ownership doesn't announce itself loudly at first. It appears in databases, in clerk offices, in digital records that most people never check. The transfer of the lake happened quietly, but its impact was already moving outward, like ripples spreading across the water itself. The first confirmation arrived early in the morning. The county recorder updated the public record. The lake was officially mine. No press release, no notification to the neighborhood, no courtesy email to the HOA, just a line item in a system that rarely draws attention unless someone is actively looking. Someone was. It took less than 24 hours. I knew because the next notice from the HOA didn't reference boats at all. It referenced unauthorized use of association-adjacent property. That phrase was new, and it was wrong. They still didn't know exactly what had happened, but they knew something had shifted. The tone of the notice was no longer confident. It was defensive, vague, and carefully worded, as if whoever wrote it was afraid of committing to a claim that could be disproven. That fear was justified. By mid-afternoon, I saw 2 board members standing near the water, phones in hand, pacing slowly along the shoreline. They weren't talking much. They were checking something repeatedly. Screens, maps, records. The illusion was cracking. I didn't approach them. I didn't need to. Because the real confrontation wouldn't happen on the shore. It would happen on paper. Later that evening, my attorney forwarded me an email the HOA's legal counsel had sent. This time not to me directly, but broadly, fishing for information. It asked whether there had been any recent changes to ownership of nearby parcels that could affect community interests. No accusations, no demands, just uncertainty. That email was the first time the HOA acknowledged, even indirectly, that their authority might not extend as far as they claimed. The next morning, the rumor mill started turning. Neighbors talked in clusters. Walks around the lake stopped being casual. People lingered longer, stared harder. The lake, which had always been treated like background scenery, had suddenly become the center of attention. Still, no one came to me directly, not yet. Instead, the HOA made another move. They issued a community-wide reminder about water safety and usage policies, restating the rule about boats on community and adjacent waters. They framed it as general guidance, not enforcement, but the timing gave them away. They were trying to reassert control before losing it completely. I read that notice slowly, almost admiring the effort. It was carefully written to sound authoritative while avoiding specifics. It relied on assumptions they hoped were still intact. They weren't. Because now, for the first time, I could act. I didn't rush. I waited 2 more days. Then, on a calm morning, I removed the cover from my boat. I didn't launch it yet. I didn't even move it. I simply let it sit, uncovered, visible, unapologetic. The reaction was immediate. A notice arrived that afternoon, referencing the same rule they had repeated for weeks. The fines were back. The deadlines were firm again. The confidence had returned. Artificially, forcefully, like someone clinging to authority they were afraid to lose. This time, I responded. Not emotionally, not defensively, factually. I attached the recorded deed, the survey, the parcel map, and a short statement confirming ownership of the lake, clarifying that any watercraft activity conducted there would occur on privately owned property, outside the jurisdiction of the HOA. No threats, no commentary, just reality. The response took longer than usual. When it came, it was not what I expected. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a retraction. It was silence. No follow-up, no acknowledgement, no attempt to dispute the facts, just nothing. That silence was louder than any fine notice had ever been. Within days, the community notice board updated. References to community-adjacent waters quietly disappeared. The language shifted. The lake was no longer mentioned explicitly in any new communication. It was as if it had always been invisible. But invisibility doesn't hold when ownership is public. The first neighbor finally approached me, not to confront, but to ask. Curious, cautious, almost impressed. Word spread quickly after that. The HOA, meanwhile, withdrew. They stopped walking the shoreline. They stopped sending notices. The legal posturing evaporated. Whatever internal conversations were happening, they weren't happening publicly anymore. They had lost. But they weren't done, because organizations that lose authority rarely accept it quietly. They look for other angles, other pressure points, other ways to regain control. And I knew that owning the lake was only the beginning. The real test would come when I did the thing they feared most, when I launched the boat. As Chapter 5 closed, the water remained calm. The boat sat uncovered, waiting. The HOA had been exposed, but not yet embarrassed. That moment was coming. By the time Chapter 6 began, the neighborhood felt different. Not louder, not chaotic, just tense in a way that was impossible to ignore. The kind of tension that settles in when everyone knows something has changed, but no one wants to say it out loud. The lake looked the same as it always had, still, reflective, untouched. But now, it carried weight. The HOA had gone quiet after my response. No more violation notices, no more community reminders, no more carefully worded emails pretending they still had authority over water they didn't own. That silence wasn't peace, it was recalculation. Organizations like that don't stop enforcing rules because they suddenly respect boundaries. They stop because they're looking for a different angle, a different lever, a different way to win. I knew that. So when I decided it was time, I made sure everything was perfect. No shortcuts, no gray areas. I verified insurance again, even though I didn't legally need to. I confirmed property lines, shoreline access, and launch points. I reviewed local regulations unrelated to the HOA, just to eliminate any possible opening they could exploit. When the boat finally moved, there would be nothing they could touch. The morning I chose was intentional. Clear sky, no wind, calm water. The kind of morning that makes everything visible. I backed the boat slowly, deliberately, down to the natural shoreline access point that now fell entirely within my property. There was no ramp, no dock, no permanent structure, just water and land, exactly as the lake had existed long before the neighborhood was built. I didn't rush. I didn't hide. I launched the boat. The moment the hull touched the water, something shifted. Not just in the lake, but in the air around it. The sound carried. The movement caught attention. Curtains moved. Doors opened. Phones appeared. People watched. And nothing happened. No alarms, no security intervention, no HOA representatives storming down the path with clipboards and threats, because they couldn't. I took the boat out slowly, staying close to shore at first, then drifting farther as the water opened up. The lake felt different when it was no longer just scenery. It felt alive, claimed, defined. This wasn't defiance. This was ownership. By the time I returned to shore, the watchers had multiplied. Some were curious, some were confused, some looked uncomfortable, like they were witnessing a rule being broken without consequences. That's when people start questioning the rules themselves. The first HOA response came later that afternoon. Not to me, to everyone. A general notice reminding residents that privately owned property adjacent to the community was not subject to association rules, and that members were expected to respect property boundaries. It was carefully written, neutral, and completely different from the confident enforcement language they had used just weeks earlier. They weren't explaining, they were retreating. Behind the scenes, though, the HOA wasn't finished. I found that out when a neighbor quietly forwarded me a message from a board member. Nothing official, nothing enforceable, just frustration disguised as concern. It warned about setting precedents, and protecting the character of the neighborhood. That message told me everything I needed to know. They weren't angry about the boat, they were angry about the example. Because when one homeowner proves that the HOA's authority has limits, others start looking for those limits too. The lake had become a symbol, not just of revenge, but of exposure. Over the next few days, the tension shifted again. Curiosity replaced fear. Neighbors asked questions openly now, not about violations, but about process, about ownership, about how something so big had gone unnoticed for so long. The HOA couldn't answer those questions. They avoided them. They redirected conversations, changed subjects, issued vague statements about unique circumstances. But the damage was done. Every time the boat went out, the illusion weakened. I didn't overdo it. No loud engines, no crowds, no spectacle. Just calm, consistent use of something I owned, in a way that violated nothing except expectations. And that was the most unsettling part for them. They had no rule to enforce, no fine to issue, no leverage left. The final attempt came quietly. A proposal appeared on the agenda for the next HOA meeting, suggesting a review of bylaws related to adjacent properties and visual impacts. It was framed as proactive governance. It was desperation. Changing the rules after losing authority doesn't restore control. It exposes insecurity, and everyone could see it. As Chapter 6 came to an end, the lake had settled into its new reality. Boats were no longer forbidden there, at least not by the people who used to claim control. The HOA had lost the fight they never realized they were in. But the story wasn't over, because the final chapter wasn't about boats or lakes. It was about what happens when power is challenged, exposed, and permanently limited. And the HOA was about to learn that lesson in front of the entire community. By the time Chapter 7 began, the neighborhood had already adjusted. Not officially, not in any announcement or formal communication, but in the subtle ways that matter more. People stopped whispering. The lake stopped feeling forbidden. The idea that the HOA controlled everything stopped being an unspoken truth. Power had shifted, and once that happens, it never fully goes back. The HOA meeting that followed the first boat launch was unusually crowded. Attendance always spiked when residents sensed change, and this time was no different. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The agenda did all the talking. Buried halfway down was the proposal everyone expected but pretended not to. A bylaw review. Not a change. Not yet. Just a review of language related to visual standards, adjacent properties, and activities impacting the community experience. It was framed carefully, vaguely, as if ambiguity could restore authority, but ambiguity had been their downfall. The discussion was tense, measured. Board members spoke in generalities, avoiding specifics. Residents asked questions they couldn't answer without admitting the truth. The lake was mentioned without being named. Boats were referenced without context. And every time they danced around the issue, the room grew quieter. Because everyone understood what was really happening. The HOA had tried to enforce a rule that relied on assumption rather than ownership. And when that assumption was challenged, it collapsed. No amount of rewriting could change that. After the meeting, something interesting happened. Nothing. No new notices, no emergency votes, no follow-up emails. The proposal quietly disappeared from the next agenda. They had realized something crucial. Trying to claw back authority would only draw more attention to the loss of it. Over the following weeks, the lake became what it had always pretended to be, a calm feature of the neighborhood, now with a very clear boundary. I continued using the boat occasionally, never excessively, never provocatively, just enough. Just enough to remind everyone that ownership matters. The HOA adjusted their behavior too. Enforcement softened across the board. Violations became rarer. Fines were reduced. Language shifted from commands to requests. When power is exposed as conditional, it changes how it's used. Neighbors became more open. Conversations changed. People shared stories of past enforcement that had always felt unfair but unavoidable. Now, those stories sounded different. Less like complaints, more like lessons. The lake had done more than solve my problem. It had revealed a limit. One afternoon, standing by the water, I realized something else. The HOA never apologized. They never admitted fault. They never acknowledged the mistake, but they didn't need to, because their silence was the admission, and the absence of enforcement was the apology. Owning the lake didn't turn me into a rebel or a hero. It simply restored balance. It reminded everyone involved, including me, that authority only exists where it's granted or legally defined. Everything else is theater. The boat still sits in my driveway when it's not in the water, uncovered, unbothered. No notices, no fines, no deadlines. It exists now as what it always was, just a boat. The difference is that now, everyone knows why it matters, because sometimes, the only way to stop a rule from being abused is to remove the illusion that supports it. And sometimes, the quietest form of revenge is simply proving that you were never under their control to begin with. As the story comes to an end, the lake remains calm. The neighborhood moves on. The HOA continues operating, smaller, quieter, more cautious. And I launch my boat whenever I want. Not to provoke, not to boast, but because I can.